Well, if you ask me, how did I end up becoming an anthropologist? I guess the answer is that I was never really set out by any young, youthly experiences to become an anthropologist or even to go to Africa. There was very little there. What I remember from secondary school is that we were, as many people of my generation, avid readers of Carlos Castaneda, right? Totally taken by the romance of learning from a sorcerer. That whole magic, of course, took us. But I hadn't. When I know that I didn't even realize that Castaneda was trained as an anthropologist and presented his books as anthropology books. I must have read it, but I didn't sort of register. Basically, I followed my brother Dick, into sociology. He's 10 years older than me, but by the time that I got to think of going to university, which was it was out of the question that I would do anything else. I would go to university. That was part of our family culture. My father was somewhat of an intellectual who actually, because of the relative poverty of his middle-class family, decided against studying German, in which he was brilliant, and started to study econometrics, at which he failed completely because he didn't understand much algebra. And the result was that in that very strongly Catholic family, he failed at his studies, so he felt he had to atone. And he actually went into a Trappist monastery shortly before, or in the first years of the Second World War. Maybe also as a way to escape, the Arbeitseinsatz and other things having to do with the occupation. But he was too devout a Catholic, so the abbot sent him away, and he married, and I became the last of 5 Catholic children in a family that in the 1960s was rapidly, you could say, secularizing, especially the children. So my brother Dick started out first as an English translator, studied translating. Then he got interested in social science, and he switched to sociology, and had a distinguished career. Became professor among other places at the university in London. But I first followed him to Amsterdam because that was even the priority, right? I wanted to go to the big city, and study there, and then we'll see. But Amsterdam at the time was a very radical town. It was the height of the squatter movement, a lot of anarchists around, and of course the whole student population in sociology was drawn into that. Including me and my fellow students, and we formed a very tight group, which usually became a bit of a nuisance to our teachers, because we always wanted to do the things that we wanted to do, and we didn't want to follow the programs that the teachers put forward. So I did an anarchism theme group, and we did an apprenticeship research into the Rote Armee-Fraktion, because we were actually, ideologically pretty close to them, although we didn't want the violence of it. But of course you still had to follow the main sociology courses, and at that time the group of adherents of Norbert Elias's civilization theory was at their height. My brother actually belonged to a more radical, reflexive sociology group, associated with the name of Alvin Goldner, who had, I think, even a pupil who was working in Amsterdam, Derek Phillips, a methodologist. So those were the two factions there, but it was pretty dominated by that civilization theory, and I found that tremendously boring, and I didn't exactly know why. I mean, I couldn't motivate myself very much. My grades were extremely low. I just made my kandidaats diploma, which was the equivalent of the BA now. And I think I had a 6 minus or something, which is more or less the lowest pass grade you can get. And by that time I met my current wife, who did the opposite what I did. She started out in anthropology and went into sociology. And she said, why don't you go and do anthropology? And the opportunity I had then was that you could swap that diploma without having to do the whole kandidaat, so the whole 3 years of anthropology. You could simply, because they were completely exchangeable, the two diplomas. So I did what was then called the doctoraal programma in sociology and anthropology both together, because it was easy. I could even double some of the courses, and the moment I entered anthropology was also the moment that Johannes Fabian was appointed at the anthropology department. That was my biggest luck. I also had an old school friend who was also in anthropology in Amsterdam, and she said, you have to go to him. That is fantastic. That is so interesting what he is doing. So I joined that class, and my grades jumped to 8s and 9s, so more or less the highest that you could get. It was, from the outset, it was clear that that kind of study suited me much more. But for a long time, I didn't have anything of Africa in the picture. In fact, I did my apprenticeship field research project, which was part of the doctoraal, in the west of Ireland, in County Mayo. Of course, still suitably exotic, so to speak. With a decent amount of anthropologists who were actually doing research there, which was a stay that made Ireland, west of Ireland, but Ireland as a whole made a tremendous impression on me. It still does. I love that place. But the research was quite a bit of a failure. I had set out with a plan to study legal issues. I think the original research question was more or less something like why West Irish farmers were sort of completely united in standing up against the police. Right, so in the sphere of criminal laws, they were sort of one block against the authorities, but in the sphere of civil law, they were competing with each other, sometimes over idiotically small pieces of land, and these were also usually useless pieces of land because these men, usually they were men left over on the farm, because most of the family had moved out, sometimes including the parents, and they were left there as guardians, so to speak, of the family property. So they were competing in the civil law section, sometimes to an extent that they couldn't even afford it financially. So that was the basic issue. Well, you can more or less guess what happened. I got there. I got a wonderful house in one of the most beautiful places in the world, near Achill Island. And I got good contacts there because the person from whom I could get the house spent every summer there, and they were well known in the neighborhood, so I had nice neighbors and helpful neighbors. But of course, none of those farmers ever wanted to speak a word to me. It was too sensitive, it was too intrusive. And of course, they didn't know whether I had anything to do with the authorities that I also routinely sort of suspected. So basically, I did gather material, but mostly through talks with solicitors and sitting in courts. And it was an interesting experience, but it was, empirically speaking, not very successful. And when I got home, and I was faced with usually the idea was you write your doctoral thesis on the foundation of that, usually 6 months of fieldwork. But I didn't want to do that. I thought this is too weak. This is not good enough. So I asked my supervisor, who was Bob Scholte, who was well known for his membership of that 1960s generation of critical anthropologists, and who was actually responsible for getting Johannes Fabian to join the staff there, or at least he was instrumental in contacting him. He knew him for some time already. I asked Bob, so what shall I do? Do you mind if I write a theoretical thesis on sort of, you know, a critical anthropology of the anthropology of the law, of legal anthropology? And he thought that was a good idea, and I got a really good grade. There was even talk of publishing it, although that in the end fell through. But Bob became my trusted friend and supervisor, just as Johannes Fabian was a major inspiration. And so when I finished both the anthropology degree and the sociology degree, the sociology degree actually on a study of, an ethnographic study of education. I studied my own classes, including the classes of my immediate colleagues, who sometimes didn't really like that. I was a student assistant by the time, so I was really set on an academic career, despite the fact that you know, a lot of the noises about the job market weren't very good at the time. This was the end of the 80s. But I got lucky. Right by that time, it was clear anthropology was far more exciting, and I fitted far better in that intellectual atmosphere. I was a bit put off by, you know, the failure of the field research experience, but the experience itself was wonderful. So, you know, I want to do this again. I want to do something like that again. And basically, Bob said, you know, of course I will always, you know, be advising you, but if you want to do a PhD, I think you need to go to Johannes and talk to him. And that was quickly, that quickly made out what I should do and why, because my first inclination, which was, you know, the really hip issue at the time, this was the time of course, of writing culture. It had just been published. I remember Bob literally running into my office with the book in his hand. Peter, this is going to make history. Something like that. I don't know exactly what he said, but he was over enthusiastic about it, and everybody was talking about that book. So writing culture was in the air, but at the same time, people like Bob and Johannes as well were quite skeptical of the sometimes overly literary aspects of it, because they suspected people who wanted to change anthropology just by a different way of writing, or just by you know, presenting the interlocutors on their own. They were particularly critical of a kind of naivety that came from you know, a disregard of major power inequalities, power relationships. Both of them, of course, were original and creative neo-Marxists, and I got that from my sociology background as well, so that gelled very much. So that was part of our discussions. And of course, the other thing that was important for anthropology and ethnography in general was this tendency to turn towards modern phenomena. And the most notorious and admired book at the time was of course, Laboratory Life by Steve Woolgar and Bruno Latour. My brother happened to know Steve quite well, so I got around sometimes and sometimes heard about these people, and I wasn't really myself already in touch with many international scholars as yet. But that was very much in the air, and when I sat down with Johannes Fabian to talk about the possibility of doing a PhD with him, he basically immediately shot down the possibility of me doing an ethnography of science. Right? So no, you're not going to follow Bruno Latour. That was not the idea. That was out of the question. So a number of demands came on the table. So if you are to do a PhD with me, you have to go to a Swahili-speaking country. So I suddenly read, oh my God, that's in Africa, right? I'd worked with a lot of knowledge about Africa, but I hadn't seriously considered going there. Actually, I was actually more oriented towards Europe or maybe North America. And then we started reviewing a number of topics that he knew would interest me, but were also of interest to him. And at a certain point, he said, "You know what hasn't been done? This must have been 1986, early 87, somewhere around that time. You know what hasn't been done? We have a lot of work on independent African churches. So we were already drifted towards religion. I always found the sociology of knowledge interesting. So religion, science, that didn't really matter. So he said, we have a lot of studies now, recently, of independent churches and religions in Africa, so set up by Africans, movements set up by Africans. But we actually know very little about ordinary members, African members, of mission churches, right? So the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, and that certainly clicked, because one of my motives, but also one of the failures in my sociology studies, was that I once proposed to one of my teachers, can't I do research into this movement of Europeans outwards in the early modern period, right? That's a curious thing, culturally speaking, a curious thing. And this was before actually I learned from Johannes Fabian some of the ideas that you could use to explain that. But the sociologists said, well, no, that's not interesting. They thought it was self-evident. You know, that exploring is simply rational, and not exploring is not rational, so to speak. That was the response. One of the reasons why I thought I can't do much what I find interesting here. So when Johannes suggested that I study a mission church, and even more when I started to realize that this meant studying not just among Africans, but also very much what these missionaries did there, and where they came from, and why they came. That was it. That was the moment that I thought, this is the topic. And then it was easy, you know, find an easily accessible mission church. Logically, it should be one that speaks Dutch, because then I could bring my own language capacity to it. And it has to be in a Swahili-speaking country. So, you know, after a very short while, only 3 regions remained. And I distinctly remember thinking when Johannes said, yes, you can go to Shaba, right, where he worked himself. I said, no. I didn't say that, but I thought, no, that's too close. That wouldn't work. Or I was afraid that it wouldn't work. And after a little bit of to and froing, I ended up going to a place called Uluguru in the southeastern part of Tanzania, where a group of members of the Congregation of the Holy Ghost, the Spirit and Fathers, from the Netherlands had worked for a very long time, and it was interesting because they also replaced a group of Irish Spiritans shortly after the Second World War, who were interim, so to speak, because the original Spiritan Fathers who had set up the mission were there, of course, during German times, and most of them, because it wasn't really a German congregation or not well represented there. So the fathers that went there were Alsatian, of course, bilingual in German and French, right? Alsace was the border was constantly moving in the 19th century in that place. So anyway, that's how I got there. But before I even could go there personally, of course the thing is that there had to be some money, and given the job market, that was not easy. On the other hand, in the Netherlands at the time, there was a transition going on from people who usually wrote their PhDs very often in Dutch, but while they had a tenure track appointment at the university. So they often took a very, very long time, and with repeated visits to the field, but also because they were simply teaching. They had the same degree as I had, doctorandus, and only slowly became fully qualified, so to speak, as we would say now. But by the time that I graduated, the first graduate school was set up in sociology and anthropology by a number of people from the Amsterdam department, including people from Leiden and Utrecht. And among them it was a joint initiative of sociologists and anthropologists. Most famous, most important motor, you could say, behind this was Bram de Zwaan, a sociologist who was a major figure, now long retired, but a major figure at the department. But some of the best Dutch anthropologists were also a member, Anton Blok, among others, and I had a lot. He became a favorite teacher of mine as well. So what happened was, when it was called the Postdoctoral Institute for Sociology at first, when that was set up, they had they had 6 PhD positions free. You could apply there with your own topic, with your own preference. But the interesting thing was that that they didn't have many candidates, so they became even more open to anthropological projects, although many of the sociologists weren't very much inclined to in that direction. That's how I got my contract, and of course I got the permission that Johannes could be my supervisor. And when that had happened, Bob Schulte suddenly died. I think he had a second heart attack, and this one was fatal. Of course, everyone was very much in disarray. But the result of that was that, given Bob's international reputation, we felt we should do something in his memory. And Johannes, who was always, good at delegating certain jobs, said to me and the fellow PhD students, Lorraine and Sel, why don't you do that, right? Organize a big conference with all the big shots from the 1960s, 1970s critical anthropology generation. And of course, we were total novices at doing this, but you just do it. And that was an extraordinary moment in the sense that, first of all, I immediately got a network of international contacts, many of them very senior people like Maurice Gaudrier and some members of the writing culture group, Talal Assad, others, Del Himes, not to forget, who was one of the most generous persons I've met. They all congregated in Amsterdam with a crowd of 300 listeners and some 25, 30 lecturers, and a huge success with a wonderful tributes to Bob and to his memory. But also with the result that Lorraine and I got to put together a book in a series by, I think it was actually a reflexive psychologist at Sage Publications. Sage was very leftist, maybe still, but at that time even more. And it became quite a success. The title was Constructing Knowledge. I think it's something like Reflexivity and Critique in Social Science, something like that. With some really nice chapters in it, and it has for a long time been used, especially in British universities. So that was a very important moment, well before I even got into the field for my PhD research and went to Africa for the first time. We organized that conference in 1988, and I think about a year later the book came out. So you could say that sort of jump-started my career. And interestingly enough, still a little bit on that sort of cusp between sociology on the one hand and anthropology on the other, of course with the emphasis on anthropology.